picture the scene, okay? It's 399 BC.
Right.
The sun is just beating down on the dust of ancient Athens. You're right in the heart of the agora.
The main public square.
Exactly. The bustling public square where, merchants and politicians and just everyday citizens are colliding. And standing right in the middle of all this chaos isn't some, pristine marble statue of a philosopher.
I know.
It's a living, breathing, incredibly annoying guy named Socrates.
Annoying is definitely the word.
Yeah. And what is he doing? He is essentially performing the ancient world's first, crowd work comedy set.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. He's walking up to the wealthiest, most powerful, most self-important elite thinkers of his day, and he is asking them these seemingly innocent questions. Questions that just systematically trap them in their own contradictory logic.
He's cornering them.
He is humiliating them in public. He is, to use modern parlance, roasting the absolute life out of the establishment.
Yeah, and the establishment does not like that.
No, they don't. Their response to having their feelings hurt and their narratives destroyed by pure logic, they cancel him.
Literally.
Literally. But they don't just take away his platform. They sentence him to death.
Yeah.
They force him to drink a cup of poisonous hemlock.
It's crazy to think about.
I mean, he is history's first canceled stand-up provocateur executed for the crime of exposing the absurdity of the ruling class.
It really is the ultimate historical framing for what we are looking at today.
It really is.
Because when you strip away the togas and the hemlock, the fundamental dynamic, a lone individual armed only with logic, stepping onto a stage to dismantle the fragile consensus of a society that hasn't changed in 2.5 millennia.
Exactly. And that is exactly where we are starting today. Welcome to this deep dive. But before we take another step into this ancient and modern battlefield, I need you to do us a massive favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the show, and turn on those notifications so you never miss a breakdown. And I'm going to tell you right now, you are going to want to open up another tab, head over to Amazon, Kindle, or Google Play Books, and get ready to buy today's featured ebook, because we are reviewing a brand new, ultra-provocative text that is just sending shockwaves through the culture.
It really is.
It's called Aristotle's Open Mic. Classical logic meets modern stand-up, and it's written by Conrad Riker.
Yeah, it's a book that demands an entirely different level of engagement. You cannot read this passively.
No, you really can't. And I want to be very clear about our mission today, because this deep dive is specifically tailored. We are speaking directly to men out there who are seeking to understand the hidden history of our modern institutions.
The institutions that shape everything we do.
Exactly. Specifically the public square, the forum of debate, and yes, the comedy club. Because Riker's premise is that these institutions were systematically captured and compromised by what he describes as feminists and Marxists long before most of us were even born. So our objective today is to completely, ruthlessly unpack Riker's blueprint for reclaiming Western civilization. And the most fascinating part, the ultimate weapon he suggests using for the civilizational reclamation isn't like a ballot box or a protest sign.
No, it's not.
It is the stand-up comedy microphone.
Right. But before we start dismantling the mechanics of Riker's blueprint, we do need to set the table here and provide a very important caveat.
Yes, definitely.
We have to be completely transparent with you about the nature of this source material. This text is intensely politically charged.
Highly charged.
Yeah, Riker is throwing some very heavy, highly controversial punches. The book features blistering critiques of left-wing politics and what is broadly referred to as woke ideology, and it actively, unapologetically champions red-pilled manosphere philosophies.
Very unapologetically.
So it is vital to state up front that our goal here today is not to take a side. We aren't here to endorse Riker's worldview or to condemn it.
Right. We are just reporters on the front lines of this text.
Exactly. Our job as your guides is to impartially look under the hood of his arguments. We want to map out the fascinating mechanics, the historical timelines, and the specific psychological architecture he is building, just so you can understand exactly how this ideological engine works.
Absolutely. So let's get right into the trenches, because the core premise is wildly ambitious, and it completely reframes how we think about entertainment. Riker is essentially arguing that stand-up comedy is not just a guy in a brick wall club telling jokes in exchange for a couple of drink tickets.
No, it's way bigger than that for him.
Right. He elevates the comedy club to a sacred space. He frames it as the modern incarnation of that ancient Athenian agora. For him, the stage is quite literally the last remaining battlefield for the Western mind.
And to understand why it's the last battlefield, we have to follow Riker as he traces the fall of the original Agora. He builds a very detailed case that the modern comedy club has undergone a fundamental engineered transformation.
An engineered one, yeah.
Because if you go back a few decades, the comedy club was this robust, highly competitive, almost gladiatorial arena of debate.
Right.
It was fueled by testosterone and risk. Ideas clashed violently, taboos were shattered intentionally, and objective truth was supposed to emerge from the rubble of the punchline. But Riker argues that this space has been intentionally hijacked and pacified into a sterile, what he calls gynocentric safe space.
Gynocentric safe space. And he doesn't just do the lazy thing of blaming Twitter or modern college campuses for this shift. Like, he actually traces this institutional capture all the way back to the late 1930s.
Yeah, he really goes back.
Specifically the Frankfurt School.
Yes. This is where Riker's historical timeline gets incredibly detailed. He points to 1937 and the theorists of the Frankfurt School figures like Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, and later Herbert Marcuse.
Right.
These were Marxist intellectuals operating in Europe who eventually fled the rise of totalitarianism and relocated their institute to Columbia University in New York. And Riker's foundational argument is that these thinkers faced a massive ideological crisis. The working class proletariat of the West had absolutely no interest in an economic communist revolution.
Right, because capitalism was providing too much prosperity.
Exactly. So instead of abandoning Marxism, Riker argues they explicitly shifted their strategy from economic warfare to cultural subversion.
See, I really want to dig into how they did that, because the book doesn't just say they subverted culture, right? It gives a very specific mechanism. Riker claims that their primary weapon was the systematic pathologizing of traditional masculinity.
That's the crux of it, yeah. Riker zeroes in on their massive 1950s sociological study called the authoritarian personality.
Oh, right.
According to his analysis, the Frankfurt theorists used this work to reframe the foundational pillars of Western civilization, things like, male stoicism, rigorous logical debate, respect for patriarchal authority, traditional family structures not as positive societal building blocks, but as latent fascist pathologies.
Wait, so they basically diagnosed traditional masculinity as a mental illness?
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah.
As a mental illness waiting to happen. Riker argues this laid the deep intellectual groundwork for a modern culture that instinctively views cold, objective, masculine discourse as inherently dangerous and oppressive.
It's a fascinating historical through line. And, to bring it back to the Agora, Riker draws this incredible parallel between the ancient world and the modern corporate world. He compares modern diversity, equity, and inclusion consultants, the massive DEI industry, to the sophists of ancient Greece.
The sophists are a crucial piece of this puzzle for him.
Yeah, break that down for us.
Well, in ancient Athens, the sophists were essentially highly paid tutors and, rhetorical mercenaries.
Mercenaries, yeah.
They didn't care about objective truth or philosophical reality. They only cared about winning. So they charge exorbitant fees to teach young noblemen how to use emotional manipulation, semantic word games, and just subjective rhetorical tricks to win political arguments and sway the mob.
Right. And Riker says that is the exact same business model as a modern DEI consultant.
It's the same playbook.
Yeah, they extract massive corporate fees by manufacturing a crisis of offense. They tell a company, your language is harmful, your environment is unsafe, but for $50,000, we can teach you the subjective rhetorical tricks and the new vocabulary required to appease the mob.
Yep.
They sell emotional manipulation over objective truth.
And if we look at how that emotional manipulation is enforced in the public square today, Riker anchors the mechanics of modern cancel culture in another Frankfurt School thinker, Herbert Marcuse.
Ah, yes.
Specifically, Marcuse's highly influential 1965 essay titled Repressive Tolerance.
This part of the book is so essential. Break down repressive tolerance for us, because it sounds like a complete oxymoron.
It is an oxymoron, and it's by design. Marcuse argued this deeply paradoxical idea. He claimed that in order for a society to achieve true tolerance, it must practice aggressive, systemic intolerance toward any speech or movement that challenges progressive left-wing dogma.
Okay, so tolerance for the left, absolute intolerance for the right.
Precisely. Riker claims that this essay was the exact moment the female-coded left, which is his terminology for the modern progressive movement, learned how to weaponize the concept of sensitivity.
So they essentially took a universally positive word, like tolerance, and hollowed it out to use as a weapon.
Exactly. They use terms like inclusivity, safety, and harm reduction as literal gag orders to silence cold, hard masculine logic.
Wow.
So if a man steps up and uses empirical data or strict deductive reasoning that contradicts the progressive narrative, he isn't debated. He is silenced on the grounds that his logic makes people feel unsafe. The feeling trumps the fact.
Which brings us right back to the Socrates hook we opened with.
Yeah.
Riker frames the execution of Socrates as the blueprint for modern cancel culture. I mean, Socrates uses the Socratic method, which is really just a relentless series of logical questions to expose the sophists. He hurt their feelings with objective reality. And because the fragile establishment couldn't beat him in a logical debate, they used the power of the state to kill him. And Riker fast forwards from 399 BC straight to the year 2018, pointing to the public inquisition of comedian Kevin Hart.
The Kevin Hart controversy is Riker's primary modern case study, because in 2018, Kevin Hart was announced as the host of the Academy Awards, arguably the pinnacle of mainstream entertainment.
Right, huge deal.
But almost immediately, an online mob dug up decade-old jokes he had made on Twitter, and in his stand-up routines, jokes that offended modern progressive sensibilities regarding gender and sexuality, and the establishment demanded he grovel, apologize, and submit to their new moral framework.
And Riker doesn't view this as just people being offended. He literally calls it a show trial.
A show trial, yeah.
He argues the entire spectacle was designed to force ideological conformity and to publicly terrify any masculine figure who refuses to bend the knee. Like, they wanted to make an example of a dominant, successful male at the top of his game to prove that absolutely no one is immune to the new rules of repressive tolerance.
Exactly.
But let me jump in here because I want to test Riker's logic with an analogy he makes. Riker makes a very specific comparison later in the chapter. He compares modern social justice warriors to the 17th century English Puritans.
Right.
These are the religious zealots who famously took power and banned all theater and stage plays in England in 1642. Now, is Riker literally saying that the modern woke left with their pronouns and pride flags are the exact same thing as hyper-religious Christians wearing buckle hats?
Yeah.
How does he square that circle?
It's a brilliant question, and he squares it by focusing on the underlying psychology, not the surface-level aesthetics.
Okay, well.
So Riker argues that whether you are a 17th century Puritan or a 21st century DEI activist, the root pathology is identical. It's a hysterical, totalitarian terror of human nature.
Because the Puritans banned the theater because they believed human nature was inherently sinful and that seeing it reflected on stage would corrupt the populace.
Yeah.
And Riker says modern activists cancel comedians for the exact same reason.
Right.
They are terrified of the biological realities, the status hierarchies, and the masculine risk-taking inherent in standing on a stage and forcing an audience to face reality.
So the sins have just been rebranded.
Exactly. The Puritan called it blasphemy or witchcraft. The modern activist calls it bias, bigotry, or privilege. The vocabulary changes, but the life-denying policing mechanism is identical. It's an attempt to sanitize humanity.
Right.
So Riker establishes that the public square, the comedy club, has been hijacked by this emotional puritanical programming. And the natural next question is, well, how does a comedian fight back?
Which brings us to the core of the book.
Yes.
It's his incredibly technical framework for joke writing. He calls it the architecture of comedic logic. Yeah. Section 2 of this book is where Riker really transitions from a historian into a philosopher of comedy, because he posits a theory that goes against everything we are taught about art. He claims that comedy is fundamentally a science of objective truth.
Right. It is not about subjective taste. It's not about finding your unique voice. He introduces a concept he calls the syllogism of the stage.
This is perhaps his most original contribution to comedic theory. Riker applies classical Aristotelian logic directly to the structure of a joke. In his view, a joke only generates a genuine involuntary laugh if it mathematically adheres to a syllogism.
Okay, so for the listener who hasn't taken Philosophy 101 in a while, let's break down exactly what a syllogism is and how Riker forces a stand-up set into that mold.
Sure. In Aristotelian logic, a syllogism is a form of deductive reasoning consisting of 3 parts. You have major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion.
Okay.
The classic textbook example is major premise, all men are mortal. Minor premise, Socrates is a man. Conclusion, therefore Socrates is mortal.
Right, the conclusion is inescapable.
Exactly. And Riker translates this rigid mathematical structure directly to the comedy stage.
So how does a comedian write a joke using that? Like, practically.
According to Riker, the setup of your joke must contain the major premise. It has to establish a universal, verifiable truth about human behavior, economics, or biological reality. It has to be something the audience subconsciously knows is objectively true.
Okay.
Then, the minor premise introduces the specific case, or the modern societal claim that you're examining. Finally, the punchline isn't just a wacky twist, it is the mathematically inescapable conclusion drawn from the friction between the major and minor premises.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, Riker argues that if the conclusion doesn't inevitably and logically follow the premises, the joke is structurally unsound. It might get a polite chuckle, but it won't get a visceral, real laugh.
And he builds an entire hierarchy around this idea, which he calls the comedy continuum.
Yes, the continuum.
He argues that at the very bottom of this continuum is chaotic, emotion-driven venting. You know, a comedian just screaming on stage about how they feel or demanding the audience agree with their political trauma. And Riker explicitly codes this bottom tier as female.
Right.
But at the absolute apex of the continuum is highly structured, universally applicable, deductive logic. And he codes this apex as inherently masculine.
Yeah, he does.
I have to pause here, though. Why is he applying gender to comedy structure? I mean, isn't he just saying good writing versus bad writing? Why does structure equal male and emotion equal female in his framework?
Riker roots this deeply in evolutionary psychology and the historical division of labor. He argues that throughout human history, male survival relied on observing objective reality, categorizing threats, building structures, and employing deductive logic to manipulate the physical environment.
Okay, right.
Because if a man let his subjective emotions override objective reality while he was hunting or building a shelter, he died. Conversely, he argues that female evolutionary survival was historically more dependent on social cohesion, emotional intuition, and navigating interpersonal dynamics within the tribe. Therefore, he concludes that a comedic framework built on rigid, unyielding logic is a direct manifestation of the masculine cognitive imperative, whereas comedy built on emotional consensus is a female manifestation.
Which leads directly to his explanation for why so much of modern, mainstream, ideologically driven comedy just isn't funny. Riker introduces an epistemological theory he calls the gynocentric dissonance loop.
Yes. The gynocentric dissonance loop is Riker's diagnosis of the modern progressive comedian. The theory posits that modern leftists are forced by their ideology to hold completely contradictory dogmas simultaneously.
Because they have abandoned objective reality in favor of subjective political utility.
Exactly.
Give us an example of how that loop operates in real time.
Well, take the discourse around gender. A progressive comedian might argue passionately in one joke that gender is entirely a social construct, like a complete fiction imposed by society.
Right.
But in the very next breath, or the next joke, they will demand that society must trust the science and mandate highly medicalized binary biological interventions for youth.
That's a contradiction there.
Riker points out that these two premises cannot exist in the same logical universe. You cannot simultaneously believe that biological sex is a myth and that it is so profoundly real that it requires surgical alteration to align with.
So how does that destroy their comedy?
Because, as Riker established with the syllogism of the stage, a true joke requires a fixed point of objective truth to serve as the major premise. Because the ideologically captured comedian has no fixed truth to anchor their cognition, because their truth just changes based on whatever the political narrative requires that day, their attempts at comedy inevitably fail the syllogism test.
They can't write a logical punchline because their premises are contradictory.
Exactly. So instead of laughs, they have to rely on what we call clapter.
Clapter. When the audience claps to show they agree with the moral sentiment of the comedian, rather than laughing involuntarily at the humor.
Right. Riker says they aren't performing comedy. They are reciting orthodox catechisms. They are leading a religious service for the New Puritans.
And this brings up Riker's brilliant, tactical application of an ancient philosophical concept, the Euthyphro dilemma.
Yes.
When a woke ideologue, a blue-haired heckler, or a corporate DEI consultant inevitably attacks a rational comedian and calls their logical joke harmful, Riker says the comic has to play Socrates. You hit them with the Euthyphro dilemma.
It's a devastating move. So the original Euthyphro dilemma posed by Socrates asked, is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? And Riker brilliantly translates this to the modern comedy club. When an activist says your joke is harmful, the comedian must demand they answer the modern dilemma.
Right. The comedian asks the activist, is my joke harmful because it violates an objective, measurable reality? Or is it merely deemed harmful because it bruised your subjective feelings?
And Raker points out that this question traps the activists completely.
It really does.
If they admit the joke doesn't violate objective reality, then they are confessing that the harm only exists in their own narcissistic fragility. They are demanding the entire world bend to their emotional state.
And if they don't admit that,
Well, if they try to claim the joke violates objective reality, they are forced to engage in a logical debate, which, as Riker has shown with the syllogism of the stage, is the exact arena where the masculine comedian will destroy them. The dilemma annihilates their entire premise.
but she's basically treating a perfectly structured joke like a cognitive guillotine.
That is a perfect metaphor.
It slices right through the synthetic emotional bonds of cultural Marxism. The audience might be terrified to laugh because of social pressure, right? But the laugh that escapes their mouth is just an involuntary biological admission of reality. Their brain recognizes the mathematical logic of the punchline, and the laugh is the exhaust valve. But I have to push back on Riker a bit here. Does he really believe that all humor has to be this rigid, militarized, intellectual weapon? Like, what about just silly observational stuff? What about a guy doing funny voices or talking about airplane food? Is that banned in Riker's ideal world?
No, Riker addresses this. He doesn't hate silly observational comedy, and he isn't against absurdity in a vacuum, but he argues that we are not living in a vacuum. We are living in a culture that is actively hostile to Western civilization.
So it's about the context.
Exactly. For Riker, the rigidity is absolutely necessary right now because the cultural stakes are existential. When the establishment is using institutional power to enforce lies, doing a silly joke about airplane food is a dereliction of duty.
A dereliction of duty. Wow.
Yeah, he believes the specific logical framework, this cognitive guillotine, is the only weapon capable of dismantling the most dangerous systemic narratives in modern culture.
And that leads directly into section 3 of the book, which is undoubtedly his most controversial application of this logic. This is where he takes his syllogism of the stage and uses it to deconstruct modern gender dynamics and economics. And he pulls absolutely no punches here.
None at all.
He starts by applying deductive logic to what he views as massive societal lies, beginning with the economy. He completely dismantles the gender wage gap myth.
Right, the often repeated statistic that women make 77 cents for every dollar a man makes. Riker uses the syllogism of the stage to destroy this premise.
Walk us through his logic on the wage gap.
So his major premise is the existence of the Equal Pay Act of 1963, which makes it a federal crime in the United States to pay women less than men for the exact same work.
Right.
His minor premise relies on another core tenet of left-wing ideology, which is the belief that corporations are inherently greedy, ruthless, and entirely profit-obsessed. So Riker combines these two premises.
And what's the conclusion?
If it is illegal to discriminate, and corporations care only about maximizing profit, then the mathematically inescapable punchline is this. If women were truly 25% cheaper to employ for the exact same output, a greedy, profit-obsessed corporation would logically fire all their men tomorrow and only hire women.
It's a devastating application of his own framework. He forces the progressive listener to realize that two of their core beliefs cannot exist in the same universe.
Exactly.
You cannot simultaneously believe that corporations are ruthlessly greedy capitalists who would sell their own grandmothers for $1, and D, believe that these same corporations willingly overpay their male workforce by 25% out of sheer cartoonish sexism. The logic just eats itself.
And he doesn't stop there. He applies the exact same ruthless deduction to the so-called pink tax.
Oh, the pink tax. The idea that women are systemically oppressed because they are charged more for products marketed to them, like pink razors or women's deodorant. Riker attacks this as sheer financial illiteracy. He points out that these products are not identical. The pink razors often have different ergonomics, they have added luxury ingredients like aloe vera strips, and they require completely different marketing campaigns and packaging, all of which is driven entirely by female consumer demand.
Riker's punchline here is brutal. He mocks the image of adult, empowered women marching in the streets, protesting the oppressive patriarchy over the cost of vanilla-scented shaving gel, when the solution is sitting literally 6 inches away on the drugstore shelf.
Right.
If the blue men's razor is fundamentally the same and cheaper, a rational actor would just buy the blue razor. The fact that women choose to pay more for the pink razor is proof of luxury preference, not patriarchal oppression.
What's fascinating is how he underpins all of these economic arguments with a massive philosophical concept he calls the patriarchal shield theory. This is central to understanding his entire worldview.
It really is. The patriarchal shield theory is Riker's grand historical narrative. He argues that the entirety of Western civilization, the Roman aqueducts that provided clean water, the Newtonian physics that allowed for modern engineering, the property laws that established order, the deep-sea oil rigs, the electrical grids, all of it was built, maintained, and paid for in male blood.
Right.
Men built civilization as a literal physical shield to protect women and children from the harsh, unforgiving brutality of nature.
So how does he connect the patriarchal shield back to the comedy club?
He argues that modern feminist comedy, and much of modern progressive grievance culture in general, is essentially just the sound of spoiled generations sitting comfortably inside the fortress, complaining about the weight of the shield, completely oblivious to the ravenous wolves and the freezing winter that the shield keeps at bay.
Wow.
They enjoy the unparalleled fruits of male labor, male risk, and male sacrifice, while actively mocking and pathologizing the laborers who built the very stage they are standing on.
That brings up a visceral, historical example Riker uses in the text, which really stuck with me. When discussing this male sacrifice, he brings up the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911 in New York City.
Yes, that part is intense.
Now, historically, we usually hear about this event in textbooks as a tragedy of poor labor laws and, like, the beating of the women's labor movement. But Riker flips the lens completely.
He really does. He focuses on the agonizing details of that day that are often omitted from the progressive narrative. As the fire raged on the upper floors and the doors were locked, panic ensued.
Right.
And Riker points out the historical accounts showing that in those final horrific moments, men literally stood in the flames and burned to death, acting as human bridges or throwing themselves from the windows, specifically prioritizing the evacuation and survival of the women and children first.
It's just horrific.
It is, and Riker uses this brutal, visceral reality to expose a cognitive bias he calls the apex fallacy.
Let's define the apex fallacy because it's a powerful tool in his logical arsenal.
The apex fallacy is the cognitive error of judging an entire group based solely on the characteristics of its most successful or visible members. Riker argues that modern feminists suffer from a terminal case of the apex fallacy.
How so?
Well, when they look at men, they only look at the top 1/10 of 1%, the billionaire CEOs, the Fortune 500 board members, the presidents. They point to the apex and say, look, men have all the power. The patriarchy is real.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, they render the bottom 99% of men completely invisible. They ignore the men dying on oil rigs, suffocating in coal mines, committing suicide at staggeringly high rates, or burning to death in factory fires so women can live. They equate male existence with ultimate privilege by actively erasing the massive, crushing historical burden of male sacrifice.
It's a heavy, heavy argument. And he takes this same ruthless, unsparing logic and turns it toward modern dating and evolutionary biology. Riker breaks down what he calls the biological catch-22. He actually pulls hard data from modern dating apps like Tinder and OkCupid to prove his point.
Yeah, the data he uses is the famous 80-20 rule observed on these platforms. Statistical analysis of user behavior showed that women on these apps rated 80% of all men as below average in attractiveness.
Which mathematically, that is impossible, right?
Yeah.
80% of a population cannot be below the median.
Exactly. But biologically, it reveals something profound.
Riker connects this data to the concept of hypergamy, right?
He does. Hypergamy is the evolutionary biological reality that females of a species instinctively select mates of higher status, greater resource acquisition, and greater physical dominance. And Riker uses this to expose a massive, hilarious societal hypocrisy.
This is the hypocrisy.
Modern culture, through HR departments, movies, and therapy jargon, constantly demands that men show emotional fragility. Men are told to open up, to be vulnerable, to cry, to abandon traditional stoicism. Yet women's biological hypergamy ensures they almost exclusively swipe right on and pursue dominant, stoic, high-status men.
So society is telling men to act weak, but biology is punishing them for it.
Riker says this is comedic gold. You have an entire generation of men who are listening to the cultural programming, acting soft and vulnerable, and as a result, they are literally unmating themselves in the name of progress. The progressive ideology tells them to behave in a way that the progressive female's biology inherently finds repulsive.
Okay, so imagine you are a comedian on stage, armed with Riker's syllogisms, and you start pointing this out. You point out the apex fallacy, you point out the hypocrisy of hypergamy. You are going to get attacked.
Oh, absolutely.
The crowd, or at least the ideologues in the crowd, will turn on you. So I want to ask you about a specific tactical countermeasure Riker tells his readers to use when they are challenged on this stuff mid-set. He calls it agree and amplify.
Agree and amplify is a classic rhetorical technique. It was heavily utilized by the ancient Roman satirists. Instead of getting defensive when attacked, you lean into the attack.
Right, it's basically reductio ad absurdum. Riker says, for example, if a gender studies ideologue in the crowd screams out that men can get pregnant, the worst thing you can do is try to argue basic high school biology with them. You don't pull out a chart on X and Y chromosomes.
No, you lose if you do that.
Instead, you agree with them completely, and then you amplify their premise to absolute insanity.
Yes. You validate their premise and then force them to live in the logical conclusion of that premise. You say, you're absolutely right, men can get pregnant. Which is why we need to discuss the devastating economic impact of taxing male tampons. We need to ask how the pregnant man deals with his prostate exams during the third trimester. How many menstrual cycles has the pregnant man experienced?
But I have to push back here. If you were doing this, aren't you just fighting absurdity with absurdity? Doesn't this abandon the rigid Aristotelian logic he was just preaching about?
Not in Riker's view. He argues that agree and amplify is the ultimate application of logic. Because you aren't fighting for the absurdity, you are forcing a bad premise to destroy itself internally.
Okay, I see.
By taking their illogical premise to its absolute furthest, most ridiculous extreme, you make the contradictions impossible to ignore. You expose the machinery of the Matrix, you use their own momentum to throw them out of the ring.
But Riker is very, very clear about one thing. Writing a brilliant respin, agree and amplify joke on your laptop in your bedroom is one thing. Delivering these hard, unpopular truths to a hostile, indoctrinated crowd under hot stage lights requires immense physical and psychological control.
It's a completely different ballgame.
Which brings us to section 4, the biology of the battle.
This might be the most intense and, frankly, the most practical section of the whole book, because Riker completely strips away the romanticism of the arts. He doesn't view stepping onto a stage as a creative or artistic endeavor. He views it as a literal physiological war zone. He breaks down the endocrinology of public speaking.
Yeah, he talks about how the moment you grab the microphone and face a crowd, your brain perceives a massive threat. It causes a dump of cortisol, the primary stress hormone, and a surge of testosterone into your bloodstream. It is the purest manifestation of the human fight-or-flight response.
And this is where Riker sharply, viciously critiques modern therapy culture.
He goes after them hard.
He really does. Mainstream psychology frames this hormonal surge as stage fright. They categorize it as a disorder, a mental health issue that needs to be mitigated. They tell performers to do deep breathing exercises, to attend vulnerability seminars, or even to take beta blockers to suppress their nervous system. Riker calls this entire therapeutic approach an act of psychological castration.
Psychological castration. He despises the idea of calming down. Instead, he tells the comedian to reclaim that panic. He says that hormonal surge, that racing heartbeat and sweaty palms, is your evolutionary combat armor.
Yes.
Your nervous system isn't breaking down. It is basically a V8 engine roaring to life, preparing the masculine body for ideological warfare.
And he brings in hard science to back this up. He cites the Yerkes-Dodson law, formulated in 1908. It's a foundational psychological principle proving that human performance actually increases with physiological arousal and stress up to a certain optimal point.
Okay.
So Riker argues that when you feel that massive cortisol spike, you must cognitively reframe it. You aren't failing, you are fueling up. You must convert that paralyzing panic into a commanding, dominant physical stage presence.
He wants you to become the apex predator of the intellect, which sounds great in theory, but then it happens. You're on stage, you're fueled by this evolutionary armor, you're executing your logical syllogism, and the heckler interrupts.
The inevitable heckler.
But Riker doesn't see a heckler the way a normal comedian does, as just a drunk guy trying to be funny. Riker has an entire philosophy on this. What is the art of the counterstrike?
Riker views the modern left-wing heckler not as a thinking individual making a rational point, but as a biological loudspeaker for state propaganda. When they interrupt a comedian who is speaking objective truth, they aren't engaging in debate. They're acting out a script of narcissistic rage. They are throwing a public verbal tantrum because the comedian violated their fragile, artificially constructed consensus.
So how does the rational comedian handle the emotional terrorist?
The cardinal rule of Riker's counterstrike is absolute non-negotiation.
Non-negotiation.
You do not try to reason with them in the moment, you do not apologize, and you do not back down. Riker gives highly specific, almost martial arts level physical instructions here.
It's wild. It reads like a military manual. He says you must immediately adopt upright posture and square your shoulders directly at the threat. You must intentionally lower the pitch of your voice, project from deep within your diaphragm to convey mass and authority, and this is the crazy part, maintain unblinking, predatory eye contact.
Yeah.
He is literally instructing comedians to simulate the physical vocalizations and body language of a primate apex predator.
The goal is biological domination. By presenting an unbreakable, dominant physical front, Riker argues you bypass the heckler's higher reasoning and speak directly to their amygdala, the fear center of their brain. You biologically freeze them and force them into submission.
This physical dominance is paired with a rhetorical strategy he calls the consensus crack.
Consensus crack, yeah.
Let's say you're facing a hostile, gynocentric crowd. Riker advises that you don't start with a joke. You purposefully state an undeniable, yet highly socially taboo empirical fact.
For instance, he suggests citing the unassailable statistical data linking fatherless homes and single motherhood to increased rates of societal decay, crime, and poverty.
Right. You drop that heavy, uncomfortable fact, and the room instantly tenses up. You can cut the tension with a knife.
Yeah.
You have just cracked the false consensus of the progressive mob. And Riker says this tension acts as a filter.
It isolates them.
Yes. It isolates the most brainwashed NPC non-playable character in the room. The pressure forces them to reveal themselves by screeching, yelling, or storming out. And while they're exposing themselves as irrational, you maintain your calm, unblinking primate dominance over the remaining free thinkers in the room.
It's a brutal sorting mechanism.
It is, but let me challenge this entire framework. I have to ask the obvious question. Riker is essentially telling these young men to become intellectual apex predators, staring down crowds, dropping uncomfortable demographic statistics, and battling hecklers with biological dominance.
Right.
But what if the crowd just doesn't laugh? Riker writes that the comedian must deliberately detach his self-worth from the laughter and focus only on the flawless, uninterrupted execution of the logical argument. I mean, come on. A comedian who doesn't care about laughs, isn't that an absolute oxymoron? Isn't he just describing a really aggressive college professor at this point?
In a traditional pre-captured comedy landscape, yes, it would be an oxymoron. But you have to remember, Riker's foundational premise, the modern comedy club, is a deeply corrupted, ideologically possessed space.
Okay.
Therefore, if the audience is brainwashed by the gynocentric dissonance loop, their failure to laugh is not a failure of your joke's structure, it is a symptom of their brainwashing. They are literally incapable of processing the truth.
So for Riker, the laugh is secondary to the truth.
Exactly. The execution of truth is the ultimate metric of success. Riker promises that if you execute the logic flawlessly, the laughter will eventually come, but it will come from the right audience. The rational men who are starving for reality will find you.
I see.
However, Riker acknowledges a brutal reality. Executing this strategy in mainstream clubs will get you blacklisted. You will alienate the establishment. So, to survive financially while telling these truths, the comedian must build an entirely new economic model.
Which brings us to the final major concept of the book, the economics of non-conformity. Riker lays out exactly how the establishment chokes out dissent. He points to the corporate behemoths, the legacy media networks, the massive streaming platforms, the talent agencies. He notes that they all enforce ESG scores, environmental, social, and governance, and rigid DEI mandates.
And he makes a crucial economic observation here. These corporate gatekeepers are happily, willingly losing millions of dollars and leaving vast fortunes on the table to subsidize progressive content that actively alienates their traditional male audience base.
So they care more about ideological compliance than they do about profit.
Precisely. So you can't reason with them economically. If they are willing to lose money to silence you, you can't beat them by just being funnier.
Right.
Riker argues that the free market abhors a vacuum. There is a massive, untapped audience of men starving for objective reality. To survive and reach them, the rational comedian must abandon the mainstream gatekeepers completely. You don't try to get a special on a legacy streaming network. You adopt what Riker calls the Enlightenment business of patriarchy.
The Enlightenment business of patriarchy, meaning monetizing your absolute non-conformity. What does that look like practically for a guy with a microphone?
It looks like a strategic retreat to the Renaissance model of direct patronage.
Oh, like the old days.
Yeah. During the Renaissance, great artists didn't rely on HR departments or corporate overlords. They relied on direct patronage from men of value, like the Medici family, who funded art they believed in. Today, Riker says that means building direct-to-consumer, subscription-based communities. You use platforms that allow you to transact directly with your fans.
Because if your livelihood is protected by a direct, free market exchange of value with your audience, you render yourself completely immune to cancellation.
Completely immune.
You don't care what a blue-haired diversity officer at a major comedy network thinks about your jokes, because she doesn't pay your bills. Your audience pays your bills.
This economic independence ties directly into how Riker brilliantly dismantles one of the most pervasive Marxist myths in modern comedy, which is the rule against punching down.
Oh, this is a huge one.
Oh.
The corporate commissars of comedy are always screaming that you cannot mock the marginalized. You can only punch up at power. But Riker uses his Aristotelian logic to flip this entirely on its head.
He demands that the comedian look objectively at who actually wields power in modern society. He points out that corporate HR departments, multi-billion-dollar government bureaucracies, the entire academic Ivy League system, and the mainstream legacy media all aggressively enforce feminist left-wing dogma.
Right.
They dictate the language, they control the employment, and they control the capital.
Therefore, the so-called marginalized classes, the progressive activists, the gender theorists, actually run the establishment. They are the apex predators of the corporate and cultural world.
Exactly. So when a comedian stands on stage and mocks the left-wing activist class, they are not punching down. In Riker's framework, mocking the protected progressive class is the ultimate courageous, rebellious act of punching up against a totalitarian matriarchy.
Punching up against a matriarchy.
Yes. You are striking directly at the true center of cultural and institutional power.
To protect yourself while doing this, because the establishment will try to crush you, Riker outlines a tactical, boots-on-the-ground directive. He tells his readers to build what he calls a phalanx.
The phalanx is a profound historical metaphor. In ancient Greek warfare, the phalanx was a military formation where hoplite soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, their heavy shields overlapping to create an impenetrable wall. The survival of the individual depended entirely on the strength of the man standing next to him.
Riker applies this ancient military tactic to the local comedy scene. He issues a directive to his readers: do not try to do this alone. You must form a mastermind group, a literal phalanx of 3 to 5 like-minded, highly rational men in your local city.
You meet regularly.
Right. You share material. You rigorously, ruthlessly debate each other's comedic premises with the intellectual ferocity of Thomas Aquinas. You hone each other's logic.
But most importantly, the phalanx serves as a defensive shield. When one of the men in your group is inevitably targeted by the mob, when the false accusations and the cancellation attempts come, the phalanx does not break rank.
Right.
You defend each other publicly, you provide alternative venues to perform, and you become a localized, unbreakable syndicate of truth.
It's truly fascinating and deeply libertarian. Riker is basically handing his readers a blueprint to build a parallel economy and a parallel culture from the ground up. He's telling them, you don't need to beg the establishment for a seat at the table. They are financially and morally irrelevant to you. Build your own table.
Exactly.
It is the ultimate free market approach to the art of comedy.
And it relies entirely on one core unshakable principle, that uncompromising truth, backed by unbreakable mathematical logic and unapologetic masculinity, cannot be canceled. It can only be purchased, respected, and feared.
So, we have unpacked the history of the agora, the syllogism of the stage, the gynocentric dissonance loop, the patriarchal shield, the biology of the counterstrike, and the economics of the phalanx. What does this all mean for you? Let's summarize Riker's ultimate endgame for the men listening right now. Riker is commanding you, if you possess the rational intellect to see through the matrix, if you understand the biological and economic reality of the world, that the time for silent, passive observation is completely over.
It's time for action.
His final directive is literal and immediate. Pick up the phone, book a spot at a local open mic, step onto the stage under those hot lights, embrace the cortisol, and begin the hilarious, ruthless reclamation of Western civilization. Throw away your fear, build your phalanx, and bear the torch of truth.
It is a remarkably powerful, undeniable call to action for his target audience. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something that isn't explicitly answered in Riker's text, but is the logical extension of his entire philosophy.
Okay, let's hear it.
If comedy truly is the last remaining refuge of objective reality, as Riker so passionately claims, what happens to a society when its stand-up comedians are the only ones left speaking the truth?
Wow.
If the universities have fallen to ideology, if the media is captured by the matrix, does the comedy club eventually replace the university as the actual center of human knowledge? Will the philosophers of the next century be found not in the halls of academia, but standing in front of a brick wall, holding a microphone, delivering syllogisms disguised as punchlines.
Man, that is a profound, paradigm-shifting question to end on. The comedy club as the new university. The comedian as the new Socrates. If this deep dive hooked you, if this blueprint sparked something in your mind, and you want to understand the full mechanical breakdown of this cultural war, you need to read the source for yourself. Go to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books right now and buy Aristotle's Open Mic, Classical Logic Meets Modern Stand-Up by Conrad Riker.
Highly recommend checking it out.
And if you are ready to join his phalanx and connect with this movement directly, make sure you follow at Conrad9Riker over at Substack. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the show, and turn on notifications for more incisive breakdowns of the books shaping our world. We'll see you next time.